event that's been several weeks in the making. Very grateful to the panelists we have, both on our first panel, and as you see, those of you who followed the evolution of this event, we had a lot of people reach out to us about different perspectives they wanted to bring to this event. We were really pleased to be able to put together a comprehensive 2 panels with some fantastic speakers. As you know, we like to educate about all the trade issues that are facing us. We addressed some of these Japanese, U.S.-Japan trade issues, I know, during the TPP, and I imagine that might be one of the topics that may come up there. But you know, I was looking back, and issues related to the United States and Japan have been something that I personally have been focused on for many years since I came to Washington. I came in 1991, and it was one of the very first things that I was asked to work on when I worked for Senator Jay Rockefeller in the United States Senate. Ira Shapiro, who's our moderator today, was Senator Rockefeller's first chief of staff and somebody who helped mentor me and teach me the ways about international trade in Japan. And same with Dan Bobb, who I worked with also in the Senate, so I'm glad to have these old friends. Wendy, who we were joking about meetings we've been doing over the years on many different topics, including on Japan, and some sage advice she's given me over the years. And Chris LaFleur, thank you so much for joining us, Chris. We're delighted to have you. It's, I think, your first WIDA event, so get a flavor of what we do here. So we have this terrific panel leading us off. Second panel will be coming up at about 10 o'clock. I want to remind folks that we also have an event coming up in 3 weeks. We're going to be discussing U.S.-China relations with trade reporters who cover China to give us their insights into what's happening in the U.S. and China. Now, as we're about to turn to this panel, I'm reminded of this. I have this cover, this Time magazine cover. You probably all can't see it, but it says, "How to Cope with Japan's Business Invasion." And it's got a picture of Sony's Akio Morita. And you guys, I know, unless you have spectacular vision, can't see the date on here, but it's 1971. So the issues that the U.S. and Japan have been dealing with on these trade issues have been a long time in the making. I think we actually almost saw a resolution of them, Wendy, I think, which you can tell us about. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my good friend, Ira Shapiro.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken. You know, Ken Levinson, I want to just pay tribute to Ken Levinson, who in the past few years has turned WIDA into a great force in trade policy. You know, the intellectual content of the programs that Ken and WIDA have organized have been beneficial to all the trade community at a time when we most need to be discussing U.S. trade policy and its implications for our country and for the world. Now, we're already running late since this is Washington, even though this is a Japan panel, so we started late to compromise. I've been doing Japan issues for more than 30 years, probably 35 years. As a Senate staffer, as a USTR negotiator with Japan, when everyone else turned to China, I kept getting off the plane in Tokyo, so they concluded I must be a friend. I spent 5 years chairing the National Association of Japan-America Societies, ending in 2012. If I were looking for insight into Japan and the U.S.-Japan trade relationship at a significantly high level, these are the 3 people that I would be looking to. Wendy Cutler, as most of you know, is the Vice President and Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute here in Washington, which she went to after a remarkable 25-year-plus career at USTR. In the history of a distinguished institution, I don't believe anyone has ever negotiated more and accomplished more than Wendy has, particularly with respect to Japan, but also Korea and all of Asia through APEC. Dan Bobb, over there, an old friend, scholar at the Reischauer Center at SAIS, also a visiting professor at Keio University. Dan was at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA, here in Washington for a long time. He worked for Senator Roth, and we knew each other back in the day. Dan is a great expert on Japanese trade, but also Japanese politics. Ambassador Chris LaFleur, we're pleased to have Chris with us today because he's leading the ACCJ door knock that's in town this week. Chris is past president of the ACCJ and now the chairman, as I understand it. And he's a senior advisor to the McClarty Global and had a very distinguished career at JP Morgan Chase. Because we have a wonderful panel, we're going to just jump into the discussion, basically, rather than have opening statements. We'd like to use our time as well as possible and leave some time for questions and answers. And we probably won't dive too deeply into the sectoral issues, too specifically. You can't avoid them completely, but you've got an excellent second panel coming up, and I want to defer some of those sectoral issues to them. So let me start this by asking Wendy, as a trade negotiator, you were always focused, as you should be, on what the United States was trying to accomplish. But you also spend time trying to figure out what the other side is looking for. That's how you negotiate. You want to know what Japan was looking for, or Korea. So, as you see it, how does this negotiation that's going to happen at some point in the next couple of months start? What's in it for the United States, and particularly what's in it for Japan?
Well, before I get to that, thank you very much, Ken, for inviting me. Great panel. I think of everyone on the panel and how closely I've worked with them through the years on different issues. And since we're diving right into the substance, let me try and respond to that question. First, I have to say that we did a bilateral FTA with Japan already. I just need to get that out on the table. It was part of TPP. And I think one of the points I just want to underscore that these negotiations with Japan can go smoothly and quickly, particularly given that I think a lot of the legwork has already been done. I'm not saying that the bilateral with Japan should be identical to what we agreed to with Japan in the TPP, but I think there's a lot of good work and has been done, and a lot of that good work can find its way into a bilateral FTA or a bilateral negotiation with Japan. With respect to the United States, what does the United States want out of this? I think an immediate need or immediate objective would be to gain agriculture market access that the other TPP countries and the EU is currently enjoying, given the entry into force of the Japan-EU deal and the CPTPP. So I would put that kind of number one in terms of an immediate need. Also, I think by moving forward with bilateral negotiations with Japan, the administration can show that its policy of trying to pursue bilateral agreements instead of multilateral or plurilateral agreements is a good policy. It makes sense, and a big country like Japan is willing to play ball with us. Third, I think from the administration's point of view, it allows them to kind of justify their decision to exit the TPP, because they can say we already have bilateral agreements with 6 TPP members. If you add Japan into that, that leaves 3 others, and 2 of those 3 haven't even joined the CPTPP, or excuse me, haven't brought the CPTPP into effect. So I think that would be something they would want to say. And finally, given their focus on the bilateral trade deficit and their focus on the automotive sector in particular, I think that they feel that the deficit with Japan, along with other countries, needs to be reduced. And I'll let others go into kind of the broader kind of U.S.-Japan, relations and how important, building kind of a relationship on trade with this administration is to the United States and to Japan. let me just briefly then talk from Japan's perspective. I think its immediate desire and probably the factor that brought them to the negotiating table for a bilateral deal, something that they avoided for about 2 years, is their focus on ensuring that any potential Section 232 auto tariffs are not applied to Japan. So that would be number one. Number two, and this gets into the broader relationship, I think for Japan, they would like very much to know that all aspects of our bilateral relationship are excellent. Right now, the wild card is trade. When Trump and Abe meet, great personal chemistry, great relationship, working together across the board on security issues, on other trade issues, on other people-to-people issues, etc. But when it comes to trade, that's where friction seems to surface. And so for Japan, I think very much they would like to get this part of the relationship on track and allowing the United States and Japan then to focus on other issues. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Wendy, for a very good opening statement, opening overview.
It wasn't a statement.
It wasn't a statement, it was a response to my question. Dan, you're a student of Japanese trade policy and Japanese politics. In my view, Prime Minister Abe has taken Japan in a much different direction on trade. At the same time, he is faced with the fact that President Trump has an aggressive trade policy. Most people, when they think about books about President Trump, they think of The Art of the Deal. But I think about another one that was entitled Never Enough. And so we can usually assume that President Trump will pursue his objectives aggressively and encourage Ambassador Lighthizer to do so. So how do you see Abe's position? Does he have political support, continue to have political support needed to deal with the president on trade?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that Abe has entered his third term as Prime Minister, and he's on track to become the longest-serving Prime Minister in Japan. Since this is his last term, I mean, some people talk about another fourth term, but I think that's highly unlikely. But now that he's essentially in his last term, I think, that of course brings up the fact that he's something of a lame duck, and as we get further along, that his influence and power, I think, is going to weaken to a certain extent. He also has other problems right now. The fact that his support, which he's maintained quite well, is primarily predicated on the success of Abenomics, series of economic moves that have actually bolstered Japan's economy. They've had a pretty long run of, for Japan, pretty decent economic growth, but in the past couple weeks, it's clear that Japan's economy is beginning to not do quite so well. In fact, they may actually already be close to or actually in a recession. So that is a problem for him, and he's also facing some elections that are coming up. There's some local elections on the 7th of this month, the second round on the 21st. We'll see how that goes. These lead into some elections in the upper house in July. That will be a test as well. So I think there's a degree in which his influence may be waning, and the extent to which he can really put up. He's got to defend himself from unreasonable demands by the United States when it comes to trade. And keep in mind, any agreement also has to get through the Diet. He can't do this unilaterally. So I think there are a few things in play that make this a very big challenge. I think also keep in mind that he has, and I think legitimately so, is talked about himself, or others have talked about himself as really the person who leads the world now in advocating a global free trade system. Who would have thought back when we were from a long time ago? But he is, and he's really been pushing that. He keeps articulating that in speeches at the UN, Davos, other places, and but he's also been trying to sort of maintain this very close relationship with Abe, first guy to visit him after the election, before the inauguration, where he gave Trump this golden golf club and so forth. Been pursuing that for quite some time. But what's interesting, I think, also is there have been some indications where he's sort of pushed obliquely away from Trump. When he gave his speech in Davos, for example, he talked about the importance of free trade. He mentioned things like climate change. So there are a number of factors out there that make this trade negotiation a very complicated set of circumstances for him, and we'll see how it goes. But it's also, I think, just in even broader perspective, this trade negotiation, depending on how it goes, is not only a test of the U.S.-Japan economic relationship, but it also gets to the broader U.S.-Japan relationship. Japan is always reliant on the U.S., but if this goes badly, if Section 232 tariffs were imposed, that would be a crisis not just in the economic relationship, but in the broader U.S.-Japan relationship.
I was struck when you were speaking that in the New York Times today, there's an article about how China's slowing economy is really hurting Japan at the moment. And it's a reminder that, as Abenomics is, it's a reminder that you can only do so much to control your own fate. And in a global economy, you're subject to either the pressures from the United States or the slowing of China or the impact of Brexit, etc. Chris, I'd be interested in your perspective. You've been in Japan, I think, 25, 26 years now. How much has it changed in terms of the openness of the economy? When we came of age in the 80s and then into the 90s, Japan's closed markets were the most significant U.S. trade policy challenge. I'd like to think things are different, but how much has it changed and how much is it similar?
Well, first, let me thank you for the invitation to join on this distinguished panel and talk about what's going on between the U.S. and Japan on trade. I'm here with a delegation of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan, which has been around in Japan for about 70-odd years, and is the largest international trade organization, foreign trade organization in Japan. And we come to Washington every year about this time to try to focus attention in the administration and on the Hill on what the key issues are for American business that's based in Japan. But this year we brought the largest delegation and the most senior delegation ever. We have the CEOs, the actual operating chief officers of some of the most large and most influential U.S. companies operating in Japan. And that reflects the fact that there is tremendous anticipation for what this forthcoming U.S.-Japan bilateral agreement might mean for American business operating in Japan, but also a level of concern on what exactly is going to be covered by this agreement and how long it's going to take to achieve it. So in Japan, one of our principal concerns is that as we move into a new negotiation, we make sure that the dynamic is one that projects a win-win scenario coming out of the negotiations. Obviously, there's a certain degree of challenge which my distinguished colleague To my right will know better than any of us, but so there's inevitably going to be some tough negotiating in any agreement. But what needs to come out of this is a sense that both the U.S. and the Japanese economies are going to benefit as a result of this agreement. And I would say that the way the negotiations are being depicted does tend to lead a rather one-sided view of how it's operating. Basically, the U.S. is the demandeur vis-a-vis the Japanese. And that's fine for a negotiating purpose, perhaps, but it needs to be clear that the things that we want out of this agreement are not simply getting onesies and twosies solved that are politically important to constituencies in the United States, but also we're going to open a path to greater economic collaboration and opportunity for both U.S. and Japanese companies going forward. And I say that, and turning back to your original question here, over the last couple of decades, and certainly over the last 10 years in particular, you've seen a pretty significant change in the way Japan operates in its economy since that magazine cover was printed some 40 or 50 years ago. And most important among those, and the Abe administration deserves particular credit for this, but it does go back before that. Japan has been moving away from the long-held position that the government should pick the winners and losers, and is increasingly allowing the markets to determine which companies and which technologies are going to be successful. And there's no better example of that, perhaps, than looking just 10 years ago to the way cellular telephones were in Japan. Everyone here probably will remember the famous Galapagos flip phones, the ones that only operated in Japan and were, for the most part, only made by Japanese companies. Those are gone. The iPhone today has about a 60% market share. And the Android technologies that Google has put out there, the phones based on those have pretty much the rest of it. So right there you see that Japan has opened, literally opened, one of the single most important areas of its economy fully to foreign participation. That's not something that would have happened 40 or 50 years ago. And you will see, perhaps somewhat less dramatically, but you will see that dynamic in many, many other industries. And so one of the key messages that our delegation is bringing to Washington this time is that American business is already doing quite well in Japan. In services in particular, we enjoy, if we want to focus on the balance of trade here, we enjoy a net surplus. So certainly we want to see some additional work done in areas that will affect the goods trades as well. And there are ways to address that also by looking not just at resolving past issues, but looking to the future. So an example would be in the automobile area. Very clearly, it's been difficult for American auto companies to export directly to Japan. I think the Jeep is the number 9 U.S. exported automobile to Japan at this time. And clearly, given that the bulk of the population in Japan is heavily urban, you can imagine that that's a limited market beyond the lifestyle choice implication. But as you look to the future, the entire auto industry is going to be changing. There are new technologies being introduced that literally will make the business models that have operated heretofore obsolete. And you see Japanese as well as American companies moving to try to adjust and adapt to those changing circumstances. So whether it's driverless cars with AI directing it, mapping services, other technologies coming out of the tech sector, or the propulsion systems, whether electronic or hybrid or what have you. Those are all going to turn this industry upside down. New players will have new opportunities, and one thing we would very much like to see this agreement do is not only make it easier for U.S. auto companies to export the kinds of automobiles that are being made today, but also pave the way through harmonized standards between the two countries to the kinds of automobiles that will be sold in the future. And we think there's great opportunity for American companies to have fresh opportunities in even a market such as automobiles going forward.